Hi, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
I think the conversation we're going to have today is something that applies to both the parents and the children. I talk about emotion regulation and self-compassion a lot with Curious Neuron. So I'm really excited to hear about the research from you. Can you give us a little bit about a little description about the research you do in your lab?
Yes. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's fascinating to be able to talk to a broader audience who might benefit from this stuff. So so what I have been doing here in Berlin is there's two things. On one side, trying to attempt to investigate the mechanisms of mindfulness meditation. In this way, investigating the emotional regulation mechanisms, so how it works. On the other side, we have been working also investigating self-compassion. It also the connection of self-compassion with emotional regulation as well, but also understanding, for example, its effects on specific populations, for example, medical doctors or special group in need of help like this.
I think for our audience, I'd love to describe a little bit about what we mean. So let's start with a few just definitions so that we're all on the same page. What do we mean when we say emotion regulation?
So emotional regulation is a broad construct, let's say, but it includes different aspects. Let's say, the brief definition is the different attempts and the voluntary actions or different ways in which we can modify the current emotional state we're living in. So this can be like several types of behaviors, let's say. And this can also include not just decreasing our negative emotional states, but also includes generating or even enhancing positive emotional states. So it's a wide construct that includes positive and negative emotions as on both sides.
I love that we have to keep that in mind, right? The both positive and the negative. It's not just about the negative emotions, but I think as parents, I don't think we ever think about our emotion regulation strategies, or we don't really think about the self-compassion part. But then when you have kids and they start losing control of their emotions, and you realize maybe you haven't developed certain skills that you should have in the past. I'd love to hear about maybe some strategies that exist out there that people are using, and some strategies that through research is recommended, and strategies that are not really recommended that maybe some of us are using without even realizing.
Yeah, I think this is a bit of a tricky question because I think most of us have a certain background of or certain emotional regulation strategies that already work for us. And I think parenting is definitely a huge challenge for those strategies that we have already. So in many cases, we need to develop certain new workaround, but what we know already is also helpful. But I think where self-compassion really can be a really helpful tool is because at least when it's the first time we are parents, we might tend to believe that we are such a failure because we are facing so many challenges that is not just taking care of the others, also taking care of ourselves. And when we face, and this is why self-compassion is so interesting, is because it's a way of targeting this little person who is behind the suffering, right? So whenever we feel really bad or something is out of control, or we are feeling in a very challenging day, we often start to criticize ourselves. And we start to have cognitions like thinking, oh, I'm such a failure. This is so difficult for me, and so on and so on. So self-compassion is really one way of validating us, being with us, and really taking care of this person who is behind this parenthood and so on.
What have you seen in terms of self-compassion, in terms of research? I'm curious to know because, we're saying that it's important, but maybe there's a parent listening and saying, when I have a really hard day, what difference would it really make if I I don't know, like if I change the way I was thinking, right? Like my child will still be screaming and crying for whatever reason. How can my thinking and self-compassion actually make a difference?
So actually what is interesting is that it's not just thinking differently. So this is, it starts from there. Actually, for example, some investigations using MRI functional scanner, they have shown that when we have a negative self-talk, so we criticize ourselves, certain brain regions like the amygdala or anterior cingulate cortex start to get highly activated. But when we treat ourselves with compassion, with tenderness, with caring, then those same brain regions, if we compare them to self-criticism, get actually less activated. So the self-talk is important, of course, but it's also what we are actually learning to do is that there is a cycle between emotions and cognitions in a way. And we are learning how to actually, treat ourselves with more comprehension, with more understanding, with more gentleness. And one trick for doing this is, for example, think, what could you say to your best friend who might be happening or going through the same struggle, right? And very often we discover when doing that, we might be super compassionate and intelligent when we're trying to help our best friend, but we don't do exactly the same when it is about us.
It's true. We don't. You're right. I'm curious to know a little bit more about how you do study this. So you mentioned this one trick of thinking about what you would say to your best friend, but how are you studying this in the lab? Are there different ways of studying this, or is that always the key thing that you have people change think of?
Yes, for example, what we have done here is, there's different ways of approaching this. So you could, for instance, use the self-compassion questionnaire developed by Christine Neff. That you could, with that way, for example, measure like the trait of self-compassion. You could also make certain behavioral experiment to measure implicit attitudes, and then you could, like if you investigate self-esteem, you can investigate self-compassion. What we have done here, for instance, is to create an emotional regulation paradigm in which we stress out people with difficult or stressful images, and then we ask them to manage their distress, telling themselves internally, I gently accept things as they are, for example. So in this way, we can really see during an emotional challenge how much telling this to them is really helpful for managing their emotions.
How I think we defined emotion regulation, but what is self-compassion exactly? I know we spoke about what you were doing, but maybe somebody hasn't heard about that yet and they'd love to know what it means.
So self-compassion is basically pretty much the simple answer is I already gave it. So it's when facing an emotion and it's difficult situation, when there is emotional pain, so you treat yourself as you would treat your best friend. So it's bringing that understanding, that comprehension. But it's also interesting to understand it in terms of there is like a more operational definition that there are three aspects of self-compassion, and I want to present it starting from what we do when we are not self-compassionate, and then it will be maybe more clear. So, for example, when we are going through an emotional challenge and we feel really bad, and we are not self-compassionate. So what we tend to do is that, first of all, we criticize ourselves very hardly. So we got strong with us, we got ruminations, we start to think negatively about ourselves. I'm not enough, I'm not worth, I'm not good in this, I'm a failure, etc., and so on, so on. So we start to think really bad about ourselves. Second, we start to feel that I'm the only silly person who going through this, have this kind of suffering. And then we start to feel isolated, right? We start to feel like, oh God, I'm the only person who is so bad on this, and start to feel really, lonely on the suffering, disconnected from others. And the last point, so when we are going through all this, and this is kind of somehow the magic of negative emotions, and when we are completely abandoned in this, is that we actually get over-identified with those emotions. So in a way, we even don't realize that we are already so much into this, and we are just acting out what we are, right? So we start to talk louder. We don't treat others very good, maybe. We maybe drive faster, different expressions that maybe we're not getting it, that we are actually in a strong emotion and we're still not aware of it. So how would we self-compassionate into this? It could be going through the three elements, is to have self-kindness. And this is the very first element. It's the loving kindness aspect, in which instead of criticizing ourselves, we are bringing this gentleness, this warmth to ourselves. And not because we want to get rid of emotions, it's because this thing is really painful, right? And we want to soothe ourselves a little bit because this current experience is being difficult. And then we also bring the second element, which is common humanity, which means that we understand this experience as something broader. So we understand that what is happening here is part of being human. So any human being might living this experience would have the same kind of emotions, for example. And this is and being imperfect, having vulnerabilities, is being human, and that's fine. And then comes the third element, which is being mindful, right? Instead of being over-identified with emotions, we can have awareness of what's happening, right? So we are not anymore being lost in a certain emotion or experience. We can recognize what is happening here, and we can be more aware and also more clear about it. And this is also the first point, right? So this is kind of a circular system, because only when we are aware of what is happening, only when we recognize in which emotion we are actually, is the starting point to respond compassionate to this experience.
I feel like we are 2 years late with this conversation. That we should have had this at the beginning of the pandemic, because I feel that with the parents that I've spoken with, they really struggled with everything you mentioned in the past 2 years, right? Especially even though we knew we were all going through this, in the sense when you're in your own home alone for such a long time, you do feel that you are alone in your journey. And I had shared on social media, am I the only one? So I tried to get people to ask questions so that they can answer them and see, like, perhaps you think you're the only one that yelled today at your child, or that, feels like discouraged with your day. But then they put it out there, and 85% of parents say, I'm experiencing the same thing today. And then the parents feel a bit seen. So I could understand that makes a big difference in how you feel in your own self-compassion, towards the situation. You mentioned mindfulness, and I think that would be a great segue into that conversation, because that's something I feel that we've been hearing a lot about lately. Even lots of, programs or apps or, parenting coaches, talking about mindfulness and saying, just be present in the moment. But I think there's so much more to it than just that. Can you talk a little bit about mindfulness and how you study that in the lab as well?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So as a definition, what it's my working definition of mindfulness is a capacity that everyone has already. And this capacity is the capacity of being present with your experience, but also with this attitude that is non-judgmental or acceptance, right? And this sounds pretty pretty simple, and in a way we all do it somehow in some other way. I don't think it's something completely the practice will in a way train our capacity that we have already, let's say. So there are different ways of measuring mindfulness, and one is taking it as a trait. That means we can understand it as again, as neuroticism or any other traits in psychology, that we can measure the disposition or the innate capacity of the person to be mindful. There are so many questionnaires that can measure mindfulness, and maybe each of them has a specific characteristic, whatever. But there are also ways of measuring what we did, for example, and one of the best methods is to investigate the effects of the mindfulness training. So in this way, we are using mindfulness as experience in the subject in the context of, for example, 8-week program, which they learn the practice itself. So with this, they trained this capacity, and they also acquired specific tools to develop this. But as you can see, it's very lots of different aspects are called mindfulness, right? And there's a bit of a confusion. So mindfulness is a trait, mindfulness is a practice, then mindfulness is a state, because you have to be in a mindful state, you have to be present. And so it's a bit confusing. And there's also mindfulness experts, mindfulness interventions. It's crazy, but we need to be aware of what we are referring to. But anyway, mindfulness interventions, though, they show that they have, of course, so much benefits but there's also some studies that show the limits. So, for example, in my study, I'm not seeing the effects of mindfulness over, let's say, empathy or more social aspects. What I'm seeing is the mindfulness has more specific effects over the self, or in the emotional regulation of the self, for instance, which is very interesting, because mindfulness training is much more about the self than the others, and compassion training will bring also the social aspect on board. So what is tend to be confusing, maybe, or also frustrating for people, is this, I think, the idea that when you do mindfulness, you have to be, for example, you have to stop thinking, or you have to be, your mind needs to be completely devoid of thoughts or things like that. And I think that it's a misunderstanding, right? So the brain is always thinking, and that's pretty fine. And what is doing mindfulness, it's really about learning to bring back your attention from the thoughts in a way, right? So we're not fighting with the thoughts. It's impossible to make the mind to be completely white or empty, right? And so we are learning to familiarize ourselves with the mind as it is. We are learning to work with the mind as it is. And the mind is crazy. It's full of thoughts. And that's fine. That's completely fine. That's how it is.
I love that you said that, because I think that is a big misconception. And from the parents that I speak with, they say, how is it possible for me to practice mindfulness and just be like clear of these thoughts and okay when I have 2 kids screaming, 1 child, getting mad at me for whatever reason, and I'm in this moment where it's absolute chaos. And as a parent, where do you begin, right? Where do you begin in those moments? Do you just say, I'm not the only one, and everything will disappear? The kids will still be there screaming. So I'm curious to know. I read some of your studies, and for everybody listening, I will have the links to your studies in the show notes, so that they can read them. But when it comes to these mindfulness-based interventions, you're looking at, or you're working on an 8-week program, like you said, that looks at focuses on meditation, I believe, right? Body scanning. So how, and yoga too, if I'm correct. Was there 3 of them? So how will practicing that help a parent or like somebody in that moment where you just feel like it's a bit chaotic around you, and you don't even know where to begin?
Yeah, I mean, it's a it's a fascinating question, because it's also great. It's also very difficult to ask a parent like that, as you're describing, to go and meditate for 1 hour a day, right? It's unlikely that you will find that time, right? But I mean, I think one of the very it's in a way mindfulness and open up different let's say skills that are very important to really handle our emotional states in general. So for example, to observe what you're feeling, for instance. So how much what you're just doing is you are not aware that you're completely annoyed, frustrated, with anxiety, with anger. How much of what we do during this crazy day that you're describing, we have no contact with really what we're feeling. So that could be a little exercise. For example, you can spend maybe just, 10 seconds. You might have 10 seconds. Spend 10 seconds, observe, contemplate the question, what do I really feeling right now?
And for those who are listening, if you are doubting what he's saying, what Simon is saying, don't, because I started doing this a couple months ago. No, sorry, maybe even a year ago now, where even when things are okay in the home, to get in touch with how I'm feeling, and I might feel tired, and I might feel stressed because there's a deadline for something with work. But just knowing that you are feeling that way and being in tune with yourself, when something happens that's chaotic, you're able to feel that self-compassion a little bit more easily, because you're tired and you don't have the patience for something, for example. So when you have those inner dialogues, it really does make things easier. So just in case somebody's wondering, will it work? It does. It really does.
We have to think that it's really, if we don't know what we're feeling, it's impossible to manage it. It's like very simple logic, it's, we really need to know what exactly we really having inside, just to be able to handle it in a better way. Otherwise, we will acting out, right? And this will have costs, right? We will shout out, we will not be able to actually tune in with the needs of our child, for example, because we are completely disconnected from even our own emotional state. So
at which populations are you studying? You mentioned physicians or doctors. Are you, because I'm thinking about what you're saying, and I feel that it would also apply in communication and relationships, right? Where we might not maybe apply the self-compassion part or the mindfulness in a moment, and we respond externally, like in our behavior, very quickly instead of thinking through. Have you studied couples as well, or relationships? Or is that too dangerous?
Not yet. It's a good point, and it's a lovely topic, but not yet.
Okay.
But I would like to. Yes, I'm working in a future project that might be maybe going into that direction, but not yet. Yes.
I was just curious. So are you looking at this mindfulness-based interventions? Are you looking at this with which populations?
So, by now I have used, healthy population, normal population, but now I was also a medical doctors. But you know what I think it's in common with medical doctors and parents is the amount of stress you have to deal. and that you have to take care of others who are much in need, but at the same time, your own resources are very scarce and you are really like burning out. So, I mean, here there's also the metaphor of the mask, the oxygen mask in the airplane, you know. Yeah. When if there is a problem, right, you need to take care of someone who is vulnerable, and you're taking care of the person. First of all, you need to have oxygen yourself. Mm. And this is a very good picture to actually know that I mean, we can go and still try to do our best with the burnout or with lots of stress, but you're taking care of another person. You cannot be completely burning, you know. That's going to be not very good help for the other and also for yourself.
We might think as parents that oxygen is, you know, having to leave for a while or taking a break away from the home. But from what you just described, it could be as simple as a small step, you know, as simple as you know, starting to change the way you're thinking when something is happening, or change, not thinking, but the self-compassion part. That, from what you're saying and from your research, it seems that just practicing that can make a difference when you're having those difficult moments.
Yes, I mean, that also within this, what I saw, for example, in my longitudinal study of mindfulness. So mindfulness in a way can facilitate two ways of helping us with emotions. So one is acceptance, for instance, which is closely connected to self-compassion. And the other one is reappraisal, which is a very famous cognitive behavioral technique, right? In which we actually change the meaning of the cognitive frame of what is happening. So for instance, this is not the end of the world. This is not such a complicated and nasty day. This is just my son wanting to get attention, right? Mm-hmm. So we can, in a way, right, cognitively cut lots of, let's say, different cognitions and reframe it for what it is, for instance. So it's very close also to take perspective of things. And this is also facilitated with mindfulness. Also is facilitated accepting your emotional states. So in a way, I'm saying here, so there are different resources that can be used from mindfulness. But I also, in my study, I have another article connected to social emotional regulation, which is also very interesting and understudy skill that can be also implemented. And what we observed in this study was that, I mean, what is social emotional regulation, basically, right? So this is one way of influencing others' emotional states, right? So it's many times actually we do it and we don't realize it, that we are influencing others' emotions. And this is very common also in parenthood, where we try sometimes to cheer up our son, or the other way, maybe we want to help them to de-stress themselves or things like that, right? So this is part of being a parent, is engaging emotionally with the other, and of course managing their emotions, right? So by definition, somehow a small child do not have all the cognitive architecture to manage their own emotions, right? So this is part of the deal. And what we saw was actually very interesting, is that when we try to decrease the distress of the other person, we also feel less stress ourselves. So this is a very interesting thing, because on the other side, we know that empathizing, and here comes again the pain of being a doctor or the pain of being a parent, is that when we empathize with someone who is in suffering, stress us out pretty much. And that's what we know. I mean, empathy is really feeling with the other. And if the other is in pain, I will be in pain. But with social emotional regulation, we can also approach the other emotionally. We can help the other to decrease their stress. And when we do that, and this is what we observe in the brain, is that there are some parts of the brain who engage in this regulation of the other also help us to regulate our own stress. So there is a benefit for the regulator.
That's fascinating. This was when I came across this term in your research, the social emotional regulation. I had never read about that. This was new to me. I had always read about emotional regulation and I had heard of co-regulation. But I'm assuming this is what you're talking about, right? The kind of the helping somebody with their emotions. And I had no idea that it would help you, because sometimes it takes a lot of energy to help somebody, especially a child, right? But I could see how it could help you and yourself like calm down if you're helping them calm down as well. This is fascinating work. Is this something that you can train? What have you been looking at in your studies? Is this something that just comes more natural to some people, or we can actually work on this?
Yes, I mean, what we saw is basically we also observed this in the intervention with the MBSR study, and we saw a trend toward increase, but was not really after the corrections. It was not really significant. So it was again part of the negative findings we got, that there was no real effect of the intervention on this aspect, which is part of the what just said. So the effects of mindfulness over the social domains, let's say, were not there in our study, and yeah. But I might think that this might be a trainable skill, absolutely. And this is, it's somehow of a new construct in the cognitive psychology or cognitive neuroscience, but it's not so new in the world of attachment, for example, in which different investigators and researchers from even the 80s already were thinking on this, maybe with slightly different terms, like interactive regulation, they call it, and there are some interesting things showing how actually from the parenting and attachment theories and research fields, we're already somehow thinking on this.
I'm gonna have to dig into that one, that research. I'm curious to know, with the time that you've been studying this, have you been changing your own practices? Has this like had an influence on yourself?
I mean, yes, somehow yes. It is quite a. I mean, I started the Ph.D, for example, really being a meditation instructor, and somehow very much of a fan of mindfulness. Yes, this is good. This is makes so much sense, and so on. And in my lab, people were not against it, but people were neutral. This was not a meditation lab. This was a clinical psychology lab with pretty nice people, supportive, of course, but also critical. This is science, and I also started to be. I learned to be more critical about this. So I passed through different stages. At some point, I got extremely critical, thinking that maybe this was maybe this was all not being able to really prove certain effects or whatever, because there are also pretty much of studies in mindfulness and not very high quality studies. But then there have been other. There was this large project called the Resource Project, and other big studies that show that it was effective in some aspects. And I also, seeing my data, I had now the impression that it's a time of not necessarily deflating mindfulness, but finding the right place. So it's not a miracle solution. And I think that's complicated, the overselling of it.
Yes.
It's not gonna make you a super person. It's not gonna target all the aspects of a person. I see it in my data. It's not gonna work for empathy, for example. And this is what other studies have also seen. It's gonna work on your stress management, emotional regulation for the self. This is my impression. And more negative studies will come out and have come out also. And this is good. I mean, we need to really have more clarity about what is really helpful and what is not. Also, that's why there exist so many mindfulness interventions, right? So you can see there are lots of them, and this is pretty good, because in 8 weeks you cannot cover a whole person, the whole amount of disorders. So you need a program specifically for depression. Maybe that's pretty adapted, and it's targeting the problem. And people who have personality disorder, we need another thing. People who have anxiety, we need another thing, and so on and so on. And people who need more compassion or empathy, of course, they would need another programs. And that's what I think that people should be aware of, that these programs are very targeted. And this is the richness of the field, to be able to handle all this together.
I love that you're saying that, because I think sometimes science is taken into taken into different contexts and used as if it's a cure-all for something. And especially when it comes to parenting or understanding your child's development, not every single thing will work for them. And I try to tell parents that, because, you might look at some sort of behavior study and it says that this sort of intervention works. You try it with your child and it doesn't work, but it doesn't mean that it will for them. And people or parents sometimes feel, am I doing something wrong? What's wrong with my child? Or did I do something, did I mess something up? And it's not about that. It's just that it's so different for every person. And I love that you're bringing that up, because I don't want, parents to think that anything we talk about here at Curious Neuron is a quick fix or, an easy solution to something. It's research, and then you try what you want from it. And like you said, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And not all research is positive. Sometimes we learn something because of a negative study, and we learn from that and keep learning, growing. So I think it's really important that you mentioned those points, and I appreciate that. I'd love to understand a little bit more about, you mentioned reappraisal, and maybe a parent is hearing this for the first time. In terms of emotion regulation strategies, we hear sometimes of the importance of our upbringing. And I just wanted to touch on that a little bit, because again, I think parents are struggling with helping their children and like the social emotional regulation part. And it's partly because they're stressed, and understandably so. But does it help to go back and understand how emotions were supported within your home, and or not? Perhaps you were told not to cry, and just any other emotion besides happy was like a bad emotion in your home. Does that have an impact on how you regulate your emotions as an adult, and how you include, self-compassion and mindfulness?
I mean, I would say the big numbers would say yes, but I think the mechanisms are very intricated and we don't understand it completely.
Got it.
But there are very interesting studies, longitudinal studies, for example, that show Lion's Ruth, for example. I'm not getting the name of her, but she's a great researcher on attachment and how, for example, the specific characteristic of mother to infant communication can predict borderline symptoms 10 years later in the infant, for instance, right? So there are studies that are showing that the way we are treated when we are a child will somehow influence our own emotional life. And this is, the attachment world have also shown this, like people who have insecure attachment, which is an heritage of our upbringing, right? It's already a risk for psychopathology. And many psychopathologies have emotional dysregulation as a central or crucial characteristic. So, this is part of another line of research have shown, for instance, so parents who have insecure attachment or have more emotional dysregulation, also those childs, they also have a higher cortisol, for example, right? And we can think that higher cortisol is a factor to having the stress axis dysregulated, and this will also is definitely a risk factor to have our own emotion regulation system, more on the vulnerable side of things, And then if we add environmental factors, life crisis, and so on, then you're building up potentially a mental disorder or someone who is extremely vulnerable.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Which sort of support, knowing what you know from your research, what sort of support do you wish parents had, in society, regardless of where somebody's listening from in the world? But do you wish that there were more programs implemented within society, or, more help for not just parents, but anybody actually within the field that you're studying?
Yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful social question. I see it. I mean, I think that parenting, and in the very beginning and the very first months, I mean, it's such a vulnerable position, right? So at least one adult needs to be 100% for someone else who is not able to take care of him or herself, And that means one person who cannot work, and hopefully that person is not single, right? So there's someone else who can provide, but still the system, is very vulnerable. And I think this social system should help to take care of this in a broader context. I think there's already so much stress happening within this diet or this family, how they will be able to cope with whatever is bringing every day is so new, that if the social system can provide some extra support, I would say that's extremely helpful for those parents.
And for the parents, so I agree with you, and I think that we need to support the parents a lot more than we are now, and that when we do that, it's for the better of the child's health and mental health later down the road. I believe from yeah. And it's unfortunate because I'm lucky enough to speak to a lot of parents through Curious Neuron, and they are missing the support, and they feel it, right? Especially, so I'm in Canada, we have up to 12 months of maternity leave, and a dad will also get, I think he can have up to 6 months of paternity leave. In the States, from what I spoke in the United States, they can have 6 weeks off, which is just not enough for the attachment and the bonding. And we have the research to show. So it's definitely a conversation that we need to have, I think, more. And that's why I tried to include the researchers, so somebody can hear, somebody will know that it's important. Given the work that you've done, what are some things that you just wish every single parent knew from the moment they become a parent? It could be one or two things that you think are just really important for them to know.
I mean, I think that, yes, I mean, I would tend to think that it's a lot on what can I say? I mean, I think it's a lot on accepting that we will mess it up, and that's fine, and that we will just everyone pass through it, and it's a completely human situation, and it's fine not to do it perfect, and we will make mistakes. And there is another researcher at Trondheim now, and he has some research has shown that actually everyone makes mistakes, but the ones who are bring a secure attachment are the parents who are able to repair. And that's, I think, very, very beautiful. So, I mean, we make mistakes, but the critical thing is to repair. I mean, that means that we are aware that we are making mistakes. We're not just going out with it. We know, okay, and that means that we really need to be accountable with the child, right? That we have to take care of ourselves. It's not only about me, it's only about the other one. And we need to be fine, relatively okay, to actually bring someone who is relatively healthy as well. And that means that we need to be able to repair when we mess it up.
I love that. I think it's perfect advice for parents, because I do know that many struggle with wanting to be perfect. And perhaps social media and this new world that we live in has played an impact in that. I'd be curious to know that. I often talk to my mother and my mother-in-law, and they're like, we couldn't compare ourselves because we had no means to. We had no method of seeing somebody else and how they were parenting and how their life was on the other side. We just knew about our neighbors and that was it, and now it's a different world. And from the parents that I do get to speak with, there's a lot of comparison and, whose child is developing more quickly or who's doing better in certain, academic skills. And it becomes a lot for parents. So I think that's really good advice and that can help a lot of parents. Thank you for taking the time to chat with me. I enjoyed our conversation. I think there's a lot more to talk about and perhaps we'll have another conversation soon.
Thank you for your invitation. It was really nice to talk to you.